Hi everyone, today for our lecture we're going to talk about medicine during the medieval times. The reason I'm doing it during the medieval times is because you had two very different styles of medicine in the West and in the Islamic Empire, and we know that both of them were able to interact and see the different versions because of the Crusades, which you learned about last class. So we're just going to do some side-by-side comparisons on what could be expected with a couple of common illnesses at the time, as well as learning about some of the general beliefs held in the Islamic Empire, as well as some of their lead medical experts at the time. So to start with, a very common medical issue during the time, were infected abscesses. So an abscess is just a wound, like an open wound, that bacteria starts growing and you wind up with an infection, which, if you don't know already, if that's left untreated, the infection gets into your bloodstream and you'll most likely die. So in the West, in Europe, the best way to treat that was through amputation. So if you get an open wound that gets infected on your leg, they cut off the leg. The purpose of that is to prevent the infection from spreading to the rest of your body and killing you. Okay? Today, do we do that? No, we put on triple antibiotics. And we're like, yay, modern medicine. At the same time in history, in the Islamic Empire, the way that they would treat an infected abscess would be to clean the wound and then use a mixture of herbs in a paste and then wrap a clean bandage around it. And they would change that bandage periodically. Very similar to today, where you put on the antibiotic and then a Band-Aid and then you clean it later that day. Or the next day when you take your shower, and then you reapply the antibiotic and you put on a new Band-Aid. So you see, at that point in history, the Islamic Empire far more advanced in medicine. Our next one, which could be a common one that a lot of people started to kind of hide, because it could also be considered influence of like ghosts or demons or whatnot, is just lightheadedness. So this could be complaints of getting dizzy. Obviously, if someone passes out, they can't hide it. But just how you feel when you haven't eaten in several hours, that could be a symptom. So in the West, in Europe, particularly in Greece, you see the treatment of lightheadedness, chronic lightheadedness, was to remove the top of your head and wash out the brain with salt and then put the skull back on. And people did survive from that. We have many archaeological skeletons that have been discovered that show healed suture wounds on skulls. There were options besides removing the top of your head. You could also drill holes to allow the bad things to escape and to put in good things like salt to help cleanse your brain. That treatment itself, again, we would think it would kill you, but it doesn't necessarily kill you. It can cause massive brain damage or alterations in your ability to function, and in which case it was just assumed the disease. It had nothing to do with the treatment. Okay. On the other side of the world, in the Islamic Empire, if you're suffering from lightheadedness, they would recommend a healthy diet. Eating regularly and making sure that food is good for you. And that worked much, much better. Yeah. We all know when we're feeling terrible, like, what doesn't happen? And then you have like a glass of water for the first time in 3 days, and you're like, oh, that's what it was. Gotta cut back on the monster drinks. Okay. So those are two examples of common afflictions that exist then as well as exist today, and the repercussions of how they would have been treated. Another concept we can talk about is sickness explanation. So, why do you get sick? And you're probably all very familiar with the Western belief for a very long time that you got sick because it was a punishment from God. And if it was a widespread punishment or widespread illness, widespread punishment. There's also belief in terms from the ancient Greeks where your illness was based on the fluids that ran through your body. So they identified 4 humors. That's what they called the fluids. The 4 were blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Again, fluids that they would have been accustomed to and would have recognized in autopsies or just in regular life. And then they would match up with different feelings. Like if you have more of one or less of the other, that could make you very sad, or it could make you very smart or unable to focus, or really grumpy all the time. And again, that will come back to their treatment, where if it seems that you're very sad, it's because you have too much of one humor. So again, they'll drill into your head and let some of that liquid out, or they could do bloodletting, where they use leeches, or they cut you to get rid of some of your blood to help balance those humors again. In the Islamic Empire, starting right away, earlier than much of the Western medicine, is the concept that illnesses are physiologically based, that it is not a punishment from God. You can pray to God to look out for you or to help you, but it is something you need to treat yourself. Okay? They didn't disagree with the 4 humors. They did disagree that 4 is too simplistic. Basically, a lot of the Islamic writings about Western medicine at that time was not that they were completely wrong, but most of what they understood was not in depth, and it really needed to be studied more. And when they wrote about things, they needed to be more descriptive in order for others to learn from it. And that's a big point. In the Islamic Empire, they really valued the concept of studying topics. And that allows the expanding of understanding, not just for the individual, but for the society as a whole. And you can only do that if you really, your purpose is to help educate others. In addition to why you might get sick, there is also the concept of medical ethics. What is the right thing and wrong thing to do? The Western belief, a doctor's first rule is to do no harm, which was said by Hippocrates, the very famous founder of Greek medicine. And he's the one that the Hippocratic Oath is based on, which everyone who is a doctor or nurse or healthcare worker is expected to take if they're going to be treating patients, that their first rule is to do no harm to the patient. The Islamic belief was interesting because it completely agreed with that, but added the additional concept that the doctor themselves should be a role model for that healthy lifestyle. So it's not enough to tell your patients what to do. You need to model how that is supposed to be done, which again brings about that concept of educating others that didn't happen in the West. A lot of those concepts in terms of belief and ethics comes from, on the next slide, Muhammad al-Razi. He was a very, very smart person. Interesting to read about what he did throughout his lifetime. And when he finally settled on studying medicine, he publishes a lot. We have a lot of writings from him. And he talks about healthy diet, what you need to maintain a healthy lifestyle. He argues there should be the concept of a family doctor, meaning someone that you go to for most of your life. So instead of seeing the doctor only when you're sick, you see someone who knows who you are and knows your medical history. He introduces the concept of pediatrics, the idea that children are different than adults. when treating for illness. So he talks a lot about the holistic view in terms of how you're just generally treated. And then he also does massive research on major diseases at the time. He does a very clinical study of the difference between smallpox and measles, and talks about not only what they are and how to recognize them, but also varying treatments that can be used for them. He's the one that argues that all illnesses have a physical cause. It's not a punishment from God. There is a reason for why it's happening, and if you know that reason, you can treat it. And he also writes a journal called The Medical Advisor for the General Public. The idea that you can give this book to anyone and they should be able to read it and help with illnesses. You see these all the time now. It's basically like WebMD. A little book where you could have looked things up if you can't get to the doctor. All right, so let's talk about our last concept, the concept of hospitals, which we are so used to having today, didn't exist back then. The very first teaching hospital is created in Gundashapur, Persia, in the late 200s. And remember, teaching hospital is not just somewhere where you go to be treated for illness, but it's also a place where you can go to learn to become a doctor. By 325 CE, the Byzantine Empire makes a decree that every cathedral town, so meaning every place that has enough money where they can have a cathedral, so a very large church, should also have a hospital. If you are a place of a big enough population that you can worship God, then you can have a place to treat all people. In 707 in Damascus, you see the creation of a leprosia, which is a hospital that is specifically dedicated to the quarantine and treatment of leprosy, which, in case you don't know, is a disease that causes a lot of things to fall off. It's like a flesh-eating disease. From a bacteria, it's treatable today. You can cure it today. But back then, they didn't know how to treat it, and you've heard of like being a leper means no one wants to talk to you because they're worried about getting that disease. Then in 790s, you see the first modern hospitals in Baghdad, which at that point was the largest and most populated capital in the Middle East. And when we say modern hospitals, we're talking about the concept of that's what the hospital's there to treat sick people. It's organized well. It's a place where you can go also to do teaching and studying for medical careers. Okay. And the last point, which is also a very interesting point, is that healthcare was considered a moral obligation, meaning you have to treat everyone regardless of religion, class, citizenship, gender, and race. It is your moral imperative to help others, okay? Which we learned all about in the study of Islam. It's a very charitable religion. Additionally, treatment should be for as long as necessary. If someone needs to be treated for months on end, they should be allowed to stay in that hospital for months on end. And the last one, which, modern healthcare probably wouldn't agree with, at least in the United States, is that treatment should be free for everyone. Again, because it's that moral obligation of the people, it's a moral obligation of the city to take care of everyone, and therefore you shouldn't have to pay for it. So, a lot of interesting things about the understanding of medicine at a time where Europe was very much behind. And that's what your assignment is going to be about. I made it a little creative writing. So just have a little fun with it. You are going to write a journal entry, and you get to pick what you want to be. You can either be a Westerner, someone from Europe, who is viewing a treatment by Middle Eastern doctors, and how do you feel about it? Or you could be a Middle Eastern doctor who is seeing a treatment from the Western style, and how do you feel about it? Obviously, you should be including something you learned today, or you can look up more information and just include what site you got it from. And as always, if you have any questions, just email me. All right, I'll see you next class.